presented by Anna Carice.
Hello, and also my colleagues Laura Pezzioli and Liz Tossell. Welcome. We're here today from Jumeirah College, which is a GEMS school, and we have been graded as outstanding by DSIB. And we just want to talk to you today about how we try and we think we can both inspire and achieve. Let's close this door. Which is ensuring and measuring progress. And I've put in brackets there assessment objectives. Now, we're all familiar with assessment objectives. We're all familiar with marking criteria. We're all familiar with the lesson observation criteria, and we're all used to being scrutinised by DSIB. And this is a very important part of what we do in the classroom, making sure we meet these standards. But it's not the only part of what we need to be doing in the classroom. And the other circle you'll see here is inspiring students to continue learning outside of the classroom. This circle here is probably why most of the people in this room went into teaching, because we wanted to do that. And in all honesty, I think a lot of us could probably admit that we have to give so much more time and attention to this circle here. And what I want to argue today, and what we want to show you today, that you can actually do both. And when we teach students to be inspired learners that want to take their learning out of the classroom, we create active inquirers, creative thinkers, and independent learners. Okay? And when we do that, we actually find that this circle here nourishes this circle here. Okay? Now, obviously, it is possible to inspire students completely in English and not nourish this circle here. We need to inspire students with assessment objectives and with our criteria in mind, and then we actually find that this circle is better for the students being inspired. Okay, so what makes an activity inspiring? There's no hard and fast answer to this. You've all got some post-it notes on your seats, and there's 5 post-it notes you should have each. Write down what you think makes an inspiring activity, and I'll give you 4 minutes for that. Okay? Oh, doesn't matter. If you've done them, I'll stick that on the front. Thank you. Ooh. As in when you finish, just hold them up and we'll come and get them and stick them on the board. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, so let's have a read through some of the things that we've already got here on the board. So we've got passion.
Challenge is coming up quite a lot.
Challenge.
Enthusiasm. Fun. Clear progress.
Progression. Real life link comes up quite a lot. Okay. Interaction, flashcards, challenging, creative, involving learners. Okay, well this is what we thought, and obviously our opinions are our opinions. There's no, as I said, hard and fast answer here. But you've got some of the ideas on there do already link to some of the things that we thought. We agreed as a department when we discussed this that for an activity to be inspiring, it needs to be fun, colourful, engaging, challenging, progression, pace. We've already got those up there on the board from you. Passion, allowing students to break rules, higher order independence and thinking, higher order thinking skills, thinking outside of the box, and giving students new ways of looking at things. So those are some of the things that we came up with. And we're going to show you now a few of the techniques that we like to use to try and create that environment. So when we think about being inspired, we think about a love for learning, we think about getting lost in the moment, of that moment when the bell goes and the students don't want the lesson to end, when they're totally absorbed in what they're doing, and in a sense that they're in their own little world with this task that you've given them. And it sounds like the absolute perfect lesson. Andy Griffith, who wrote a book, Outstanding Teaching Engaging Learners, describes this moment as flow. And he's watched hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of English lessons and looked at the outstanding lessons that he has seen and has created a book about different strategies he's noticed that work and that create this sense of flow. I highly recommend this book to you. I'm just going to talk to you about one of the ideas that he has given me and I've used in my lessons and I have found to be very successful. If you turn to page 3 of the booklet that I've given you, you can see 2 examples of learning grids. Okay, now these are used when students are working independently or in pairs, and they can be used for any task at all. The first one you'll see is used for a writing task, and I made this for some Key Stage 3 students who were bottom set, and they had planned a story and they needed to write the story in this lesson. Okay, now the way it works is you are given a dice and you roll the dice, and actually this has come out wrong on the photocopy. It should have numbers along the top as well as down the side. You're given the dice, you roll it twice, and then you match your numbers up to the corresponding square. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So when they get to that square, let's say I've rolled 1 and 2, I get to the word personification, and the students go, okay, I will write the next part of my story, and I will use some personification in the next part. Okay. So it becomes a game that they can control and manage themselves, that is pushing them to use a variety of writing ingredients. I do not need to intervene in that game. I can walk around the room and they're all very happily continuing the task. And with this bottom set of students, when I did this, some of those students wrote more than I've ever seen them write, and they used a wide variety of language features that helped to push them up my assessment ladder. And I honestly had one of those light bulb moments when the first time I did this, and I thought, yes, this is flow in my lesson. You can see the bottom one is actually an analysis grid, and I use this for my Year 12 media students. Okay, so completely different age and ability range. And these are different features that they need to look out for when analysing a media text. So they were looking at a very short film clip. They had the film clip on iPads, so they could watch the film clip as many times as they wanted. And again, in pairs, they were rolling the dice, and they had to find an example of this feature and analyse it. Again, this pushed them to look at this film clip in so many more different ways than they would have done if I'd just said, analyse the film clip. And again, they become lost in their own world and their game of rolling that dice and carrying on with that analysis. So I found that to be very helpful. I made these myself. Yeah?
What is the name of what's the heading of this flowchart of this game?
It's called a learning grid.
Okay,
learning grid. Yeah. So I made these myself, having read this book. There are examples of these in this book. The writer of this book does argue that you should be making ones that are specific to your lesson, and they can be for any ability range as long as you're making sure the content is challenging enough, and that actually you can get students to make their own learning grids as a homework. Okay, again, getting them to think outside of the box and think about what they're actually trying to achieve with their lesson. Okay. Another technique that I like to use when I'm trying to get students to think outside of the box and to stretch their thinking is argument strips. And if you look at page 4 of your handout, you'll see on the bottom slide is some examples of strips of sentences that I physically cut out onto card, and I walk around the room and give each table a different strip of paper. This gives them a point of view that they have to argue about a particular character or particular issue in the lesson. This one is about Richard III, and you'll notice as you read along them, some of them are quite straightforward, like Richard enjoys punishing others for his own pleasure, and the last one a little bit more complex. So society is responsible for creating people with attitudes like Richard III. Okay, now by handing these strips out amongst the class, I could differentiate and give different ability groups harder things to argue, but B, I was also forcing students to come up with arguments and think about the text in ways that they wouldn't have done before. I was stretching their perception and their ability to talk about the text in a number of ways. And you can make strips like this for obviously any topic that you're teaching. And the last thing for me, when I want my students to think conceptually about things and I want them to move past the basic interpretation of something, I like to use Play-Doh, drawing and string in my lessons. Okay, so for example, I might set a task as a starter of a lesson, use this Play-Doh to represent the relationship between the two characters, give them 5 minutes to make this piece of modern art, and then move around the classroom, and each group explains why this represents a relationship between those characters. This can work well as a starter or as a plenary, depending on where you are in that scheme of work. Another one is draw Lady Macbeth's feelings for her husband. Again, just an example of the kinds of things you can do. You don't have to base it on a character. You could say draw society, or draw love, or draw anger, anything that relates to the poem or the text that you're looking at that lesson. Another one is string. So you can use string to represent the changing feelings of characters throughout a text. So string is particularly good when you want to look at the progression of something, and they can kind of play around with it and create a graph. Now, obviously, you can draw a graph, but when you're trying to generate group discussion and you want students to argue against each other and challenge each other's ideas, obviously you can move string around, can't you? So there's a little bit more scope for that. And then, of course, they have to justify their ideas to the rest of the class. So those are some things that I like to do. I'm now going to hand you over to my colleague, Laura Pezzioli, and she's going to show you some of her ideas.
All right, then one of the first things that I would use, if you take a look in your resource pack on about page 13, they're not actually numbered after the PowerPoint, but you'll see a independent differentiated learning sheet. Now what the learning sheet can do, it really encourages both independent learning and it really pushes those higher abilities. What we do within that differentiated learning sheet, have we all got it? Sorry. Page 13, yeah. There's an example there. Well, there's 2 examples in there. One's blank so that you can use it for whatever topic you're on. Then there's an example of a mice and men one that I've used within lessons. And what I've done is just split up the learning objectives to you must do this, you could do this, and you should do this. Really pushing those higher level achievers, but at the same time you're able to differentiate for the lower ability students as well, making sure that they are making just the right amount of progress that they need to do. It really encourages creativity, and I've found that it works really well. You can just give the sheet and the students can really just work at their own level of pace. It's really, really independent, but at the same time really make sure that you're pushing each of those individuals. One of the things that we're a little bit against, especially as English teachers, is bringing in technology to our subjects. We are favourers of pen and paper. So when you throw a laptop in there, it tends to go wrong. So what I've been looking at is Google Apps. I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but on Google Drive, what it actually gives you the ability to do is share a whole presentation with a class. So what they could do, and the example that I've got here for you, for a class that I did, it was a really low-level class. But what we were able to do, I split them up into groups. They each had to work on a different slide. So, for example, group 5 were working on language devices. All they had to do was come up with the examples for each of the individual language devices. I had 4 other groups that were working on different types of literacy skills. They all built up those skills, and then as a class, they managed to collaborate together and create their own story. Again, it's really independent. It allows them all to be working on their own, but at the same time, the Google Drive does allow you to interact with the students. So you can actually, there's a chat facility, almost like a live help. So if they need your help, you're able to comment throughout the presentation. You can leave them any advice that you need to, as well as making sure that they're all on task because you can see exactly what they're doing. It'll be on your screen because you will have created the presentation. So there's no searching the internet when they're meant to be looking at literacy devices. Thirdly, it's on Google Drive. All you need to do is sign up for a Google Apps, and then you go on Google Drive. You can create your class list and then just share it with everybody. There were instructions on the PowerPoint, so there should still be. No. What I could do, though, is get you a list of instructions. It's so easy, and the thing is, we're so against technology in classes, and we shouldn't be, because it's literally so simple to create these devices. All you have to do is put in your register, and then it's emailed to everyone, and you can all share these resources as well. Very easy. Thirdly, what I do, something that we often avoid, because it can be quite daunting for a student, is making sure that they know exactly what is on the mark scheme. So what I've done with a Year 10 class of mine is when we're planning, we create it as a mind map. So we'll have the question in the middle, but then we'll identify separate areas of the mark scheme and create answers for those areas to make sure that it's all in the plan. So for example, you've got to use evidence within an answer. So we'll make sure that we've got 5 quotes around our mind map. From there, we'll mind map further out and get a language device within that evidence. And then further out to context and so on, so that you've met all the mark scheme within your plan. They've then got that to create an actual draft. All they've got to do is take those points and create bigger paragraphs from there. And then instead of just ignoring them and going back, just giving them a mark for a final assessment and then leaving it, what we do is go back to that final assessment and go through and identify all that criteria again. Find the evidence in your essay, find the language devices in your essay. They'll highlight it, they pick it all out, and they know exactly themselves what it is that they've got to improve. So rather than you just putting a comment on the end of their essay, and that's it, you don't come across it again, they've actually identified themselves what it is that they need to do. There's an example of that in your resource pack as well. So I've got, here's the mind map, that's the Lady Macbeth one. So they've picked out the evidence, and then from there they've identified language, and then context. Yeah? Oh, no. We do it as a class. Yeah, so I'll say, right, tell me 5 things that you know about Lady Macbeth, and they'll go through a soliloquy perhaps and find 5 quotes, and they'll add them on. And then I'll say, right, go back to your quotes, find the language device within it, and then they'll all do it. So I'm doing it as a class, but they're doing it as individuals at the same time. And then if you turn over from the Lady Macbeth one, past the mark scheme, that's where they've highlighted and identified those areas within there. It really makes sure that they are achieving, but at the same time they are enjoying it. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
He's just down there.
Okay, so one of the things that let me just. It's all right. Okay, so one of the things that is quite a big part of English teaching, and whether that's Year 7 right up into sort of Year 13, is the identification of obviously quotations or textual evidence, and actually students figuring out what to say about that is actually quite imaginative and is actually something that perhaps is very independent of the teacher. If you turn in your booklet, I'm going to show you just, for example, a mark scheme. Okay, so if you just turn in your booklets to, you'll find a page that says C assessment criteria at the top. Okay, so this is a mark scheme that we obviously, if you obviously are with an exam board and you use mark schemes, things like this will be very, are often quite difficult sometimes with English, because students will say, if I want to achieve a band 7, which is the highest band, this is for the IGCSE English, okay, for AQA. But, my experience of English specifications and mark schemes, they're actually all pretty similar anyway in terms of expectations. So if you have a look at the top one, band 7, you'll see that it says they want critical, imaginative, and an evaluative response to texts and tasks. Okay, and then if you look at the third one, it says sophisticated and impressive interpretations using imaginatively selected textual detail. Now, the problem with that, I think for most students, is that when they find a quote, they put the quotation in and they just say whatever they want about, all of the words within the quotation. Now, what students need to learn to attain sort of the higher bands is, it seems quite simple, and we say to them, yes, but what are the words that matter within that quotation? What are actually the words that are making you think that, or you feel that about the character or about the setting? And students really struggle with that. Not so much the higher ability students, because you can kind of give them that instruction and they can kind of just get on with it. But what I've found perhaps with lower ability students is, you give them a quotation and they just basically tell you what the quotation says, rather than actually saying, it shows this, it shows that. So what I've found with one of my classes, and I do this a lot with more so my lower ability, but my higher ability students enjoy it as well, is that we look at a quotation and we say, okay, first of all, what individual words matter? And this is actually work that I've had, I've got blue tack, taken it off my classroom wall. So this is from Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. And they were talking about Mrs. Havisham, and they're trying to figure out what kind of a person she is. And so I chose this quotation for them, and I said to them, within that quotation, what is the word that really matters? And obviously they said, okay, glimpse. And I said, okay, why? And they started to tell me, and I said, no, draw it for me. Draw for me what glimpse actually means and what it shows. So one of the groups obviously drew this window with the curtain covering most of the window and only a glimpse of the window, a glimpse of the outside, and then obviously they've got the cloud with a glimpse of the sunshine. So what they were starting to realise from visualising it, what the word represents to them, they were able to start to think, actually, that is what the language means. Light, little, there's some shadows, maybe the light connects to the idea of hope, because we connect light with hope, and obviously there's a little hope. What happens in the dark, one of them's written, there's no hope. Hope suggests maybe there's fear instead. Okay, and it's dark and there's not much light. So they're getting the ideas visually. I'm not asking them to get the dictionary. I'm not asking them to say, okay, give me the dictionary definition. And this is where imaginative response comes to from language. It doesn't necessarily always come from a dictionary or learn. It's very easy for us to say, well, go and get a dictionary and look at what that word means. They may need to look at what the word means, but if you then say to them, but what do you think that would look like? Okay, and lower ability students respond to this because it's a visual learning process. It's not something where they've got to read and write heavily. Okay, so then what happens is, from these ideas, they can then put together, I'm going to ask my colleagues to help me here, they can then start to put together an analysis paragraph. Okay, so you can see here that my students have come up with their point, okay, and they've identified. Then we've obviously got our evidence, okay, so that's the evidence they've chosen. And then what they've written, their explanation or their analysis, is based on their ideas from the visual. So the students have written, the word glimpse suggests to the reader that Havisham may have small hope. That's an idea they've got from the idea of a lack of light. Light could think about, connect to hope. Small hope for herself, and this may relate to what happened to her on her wedding day. The word glimpse, so then we're focusing in on the individual word that matters, because they understand that in that whole quotation, it's that word that matters. And that's what the exam boards are looking for with close analysis and interpretation and imaginative detail. The word glimpse makes the reader, now we're focused on the reader, makes the reader feel a bit sorry for her. And that obviously she is lonely because of the small amount of sunlight or hope that appears in her life. The writer is possibly, so now we've got a writer focus as well, so you can, teach them to say, what does the reader think? Why has the writer done this? The writer is possibly trying to show us that this is what life was like without a husband for her, and how something like this can change a person completely. Okay, so that is hitting, a large part of that idea of imaginative and evaluative response. Obviously, students have got to do that consistently throughout the essay to be able to get that mark. but that's just a very small way of teaching them how to focus. And it's much more visual. You know, we all know that our students would probably enjoy that a lot more than us just giving them lots of quotations and saying, what do they show? What do the quotations show? The other thing that I've done is sometimes you cannot, with ranking words, you can't avoid large quotations. You can't, because it's important and it's necessary. But what you can do to students is say, look, rather, you know, if you're going to then analyse it afterwards, you can still rank the words of importance in that quotation. So you can say to them, which word in that quotation impacts you the most, that you think the writer has deliberately chosen the most. And that's quite a fun activity for them. And especially if you put it on separate cards and make them rank them kind of as a sorting activity, because actually the arguments that they have within groups and say, no, that word's more important more to me. And that's where you get a personal response from the students, because sometimes in a group not all of them will believe the same things. So it's quite nice for them to have their own ideas. And then what you don't get, hopefully, is 24, 25 essays that are all kind of writing the same things, because they've had a bit more of a personal involvement with it. So the visual element, as I've said, is I found it helps a lot. And even, you know, I've got a very high ability Year 11 group who are very, very bright, but even they enjoy that, because it actually makes them think of new ideas about what words mean. Because we know that as English teachers, it's the connotations of the word that matter. It's the ideas, it's what makes the reader think and feel. And that's why the writer has chosen those. And that's what we desperately are trying to get them to understand when we're teaching them. Okay, for the next one, this really comes from, again, writing English essays when they have to analyse and interpret an argument, or perhaps they're doing comparative writing. And some of the tasks, next two tasks, this task in particular, I came up with because I really believe, and I know there was obviously James Britton, the educationist, said that, you know, reading and writing floats on a sea of talk, which is really true in English, because if students don't have time to think about verbally what they're going to write, you know, they need that time to process it. And so what I've done is essentially if my students are writing an essay where they've got to really analyse a character, we know that if they're analysing characters, or they're doing something like very similar to that with setting, or whatever it is they're analysing, we know that they have to look at both sides. They don't always need, the questions are usually to what extent, okay, or, for example, explore the presentation of this character. Now, one of the things about what students often do is they have a personal feeling about a character, and they say, that's what I think, that's what I'm going to write. Okay, and we know that one of the hardest things is to say to them, yes, but there needs to be another interpretation. It's about, you know, other people could interpret this quite differently to you. And writers, you know, have a way of saying, you know, for example, do you feel this about this character, or do you feel this? It's the complex characters that we often are meant to have mixed feelings about. And students will, but they'll still always say, well, I just need to have one opinion. So this essentially helps students, this activity helps them, first of all, with clarity of what it is they're going to say. So we don't have, you know, very jumbled up opinions and ideas in essay, and we don't really feel there's a direction to the essay. It helps them with evidence and interpretation, because you'll see from the task they have to find the evidence and come up with their interpretations. It helps with them understanding different opinions, and it makes them have empathy for actually other people's opinions and ideas. So I do this task a lot at GCSE. This is actually what I did with my Year 9s recently. Okay, so we were looking at Curly's Wife, which is from a very famous novel of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. And I basically split the class into different teams, into different groups. And we set the classroom up as a courtroom. And what I did was I gave, and I do this a lot, you can do this with any kind of argumentative writing or ideas before they write an essay. Okay, so not after, they need to do this before. So I gave my prosecution teams this statement. Okay, the death of Curly's wife was tragic, but she only had herself to blame. Okay, and they are the prosecution team, and that is their argument. That is what they are going to prove to the class, with textual evidence, with interpretation. My defence teams are, on the other hand, are obviously going to defend Curly's wife and say this is why who did not deserve to die.
Okay, and then they have to use their textual evidence. It's like being, I guess, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know, but I guess it's very similar to them basically creating a case or creating an argument. I've had students even make evidence for when they present this, okay? I've had students produce, because they've really involved themselves in it, because they don't see it as an English writing task. They see it as, oh, this is brilliant. I get to pretend that I'm some kind of lawyer and this is a courtroom. And what happens is the students work together, they collate their evidence for their statement, they present their evidence, and then the class decides unanimously with a vote, guilty or not guilty. And they enjoy it, it's fun, okay, because they see the connection. What they have to do is, while they're listening, is obviously make notes about the different arguments that are being presented. What then happens is you can then set this as an essay. And actually they've got their essay planned because they've already listened, they've thought about other interpretations, they've thought about other ideas, they've got the evidence for the other ideas. They can still have their own opinion because all students need to have their own opinion. But ultimately, this makes them realise, in a more creative way, rather than as just saying, okay, let's put a table in our books and let's say how she could be this way and how she could be that way. What you're doing here is actually making them feel like they're a lot more involved in the process. And it's just, it really does work. I've done this for years now, and classes really respond to it. And what you get out of them is much better essays and much better arguments because they've involved themselves in something. They're quite passionate. You will get students that will say, I don't believe that, I don't want to be in the prosecution team because that's not my opinion. And that's actually what you want, because then you can say, well, that's good then that you're in that team, because then you'll perhaps start to empathise and see the other side of the argument a little bit more. Okay? And it works, it's great with Key Stage 3 children, particularly when they're starting to learn how to do different interpretations. But again, I've used this with A-level students as well, because it's just as important for them to understand that there are different interpretations. And the last one, which is just something about sort of giving a little bit more independent learning and ownership of learning and an opportunity to explore the subject. A poetry unit at Key Stage 3 at our school, we base it on speaking and listening. And they have to have a discussion about what is poetry, does it matter, why is it important, why do people study it. And for my year 9s, that's quite a conceptual idea. It's not kind of something that you would, even we as English teachers may struggle to come up with clear definitions for that. But what I've found is that it's something to inspire something about poetry, because you will have students that love it and students that hate it. Okay, and even us as teachers, we will have certain feelings about it. So what I always do with this unit is you've got to find a way to help them find their own way of liking poetry. So what I do with my year 9 is they create their own poetry anthology. So they find the poetry they like. They explain to me why they like them. So you can see the work that I get. So for example, this student here, she's basically gone right back to her childhood and looked at how poetry that children have. It's kind of, such a big thing when you're little and then you grow out of it. And that's what her research was about. Okay, so she's obviously produced this anthology for me, and you can see that she's then thought about why children enjoy it, and it's actually quite in depth. And then obviously this one just did my favourite poems, but she's got a real range in here. She's got in here by Rudyard Kipling, she's put there's a T.S. Eliot in here. Now, she didn't know, I haven't taught them any of that, obviously, because I have a set curriculum for the poems that I'm teaching, but they sort of obviously been researching and thought, and they've come to me and said, I quite like that poet, and I've said, well, maybe look at this poet because you might enjoy them as well. And that's kind of completely independent and creative. And then this one again, you can see, and she's done poems about growing up. Okay, so they pick themes and ideas, some of them have done them on their favourite poet, but it's a way of kind of inspiring them outside of the classroom, so that we aren't always, this is what you're studying, and this is the only thing you're going to study. It's about saying to them, you go and find something you like. And when they do their assessments and you ask them what is poetry, they will inevitably talk about what they've found out, because they're not just giving you the answer that you've given them as a teacher. And that just inspires them. And some of them may find poetry. They may even find something that they really love. And that's
the the crux of English really, is to try and get them to do something outside. So just to finish up, I know we're at the end, so hopefully we've